Given that disasters, both natural and man-made, result in so much death and destruction, how could anyone possibly see them as a positive thing? The answer lies in the concept of disaster capitalism, which journalist and activist Naomi Klein defines as orchestrated raids on the public sphere in the wake of catastrophic events, combined with the treatment of disasters as exciting market opportunities. In Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, she describes the process of disaster capitalism as occurring in 3 stages of shock. The initial shock is the disaster, which could include hurricanes, earthquakes, coups, invasions, market crashes, or anything else that causes a significant disruption in the public psyche. The second stage is economic shock therapy, in which governments institute a series of punishing policies that could include cuts to the social safety net, such as welfare or social security, privatization of public assets, such as natural resources, infrastructure, or public schools, and market deregulation, allowing drastic cuts to wages and eliminating price controls on vital resources. This trifecta of economic policies are touted by international bodies such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, who often refuse to give loans to countries struggling in the wake of disasters without first implementing their policy packages. The final stage of shock is more literal than the others, as governments resort to methods of torture and imprisonment in order to silence those who protest the implementation of these policies. Disaster capitalism is highly undemocratic, as it's extremely hard for citizens to object to the actions of their government when they're focused on the day-to-day survival of themselves and their loved ones. The breakneck speed at which governments impose economic shock therapy only makes the window for fighting back even smaller. To introduce the concept of disaster capitalism, it is useful to first explore one of its first recorded instances, and one of the first experiments in neoliberalism, Augusto Pinochet's 1973 coup in Chile. The first shock in this case was the coup itself. Though leftist President Salvador Allende had no organized military force defending him, Pinochet still made a massive spectacle of the coup, firing on the presidential palace with fighter jets and launching 24 rockets into it. Pinochet then sent out a roving death squad, known as the Caravan of Death, to execute high-profile political prisoners to send a message against potential resistors. This rapid campaign of terror served to disorient the public. The second shock was a set of economic reforms carried out by Pinochet's technocratic clique of economists known as the Chicago Boys. These economists, named after their influence by the University of Chicago's School of Economics, led by free market ideologue Milton Friedman, published a massive document known as the BRIC, which contained reforms mandating a 10% cut in government spending, an end to price controls on necessities like bread, and an allowance of total free trade from foreign multinational corporations. While some Western economists lauded these reforms due to how they created growth and high rates of return on foreign investments, the prosperity was not shared equally among all Chileans. 45% of the population fell below the poverty line, while the richest 10% of Chileans saw their incomes increase by 83%. The real winners were the shareholders in foreign corporations, wealthy Chilean market speculators known as the piranhas, and Pinochet's own military regime. The third and final shock was the crushing of political dissent. One well-known example was when Pinochet imprisoned a large number of dissenters in the National Soccer Stadium in the months following his coup, killing an estimated 41 prisoners in the 8 weeks it acted as a detention center. Since open killings damaged the PR of his regime, Pinochet instead preferred making his political opponents disappear. One favorite method of the Chilean secret police was disposing of victims by dropping them into the ocean from helicopters. The constant fear that you could be the one who disappeared next kept anyone who opposed Pinochet's unpopular economic agenda in line. To look at a more recent example of disaster capitalism in action, let's look towards the ongoing process in Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria. In this case, the initial shock occurred when the hurricane struck the island on September 20th, 2017, leaving destruction in its wake. Though estimates for the death toll vary, one study from the New England Journal of Medicine found that there were 4,645 excess deaths in the 2 months following the hurricane, over 1,000 more than the 9/11 attacks. Additionally, the hurricane resulted in $90 billion worth of property damage and displaced thousands. The effects of the hurricane lingered on far beyond the initial impact, as 45% of households were without power 4 months after it struck. Before we look into the economic aspects of disaster capitalism in Puerto Rico, it is important to first understand the colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. It was first acquired as a colony of the U.S. following the Spanish-American War of 1898. From the very beginning, the island was seen as little more than a foreign possession, as is made clear by the remarks of Supreme Court Justice Henry Billings Brown that it was inhabited by alien races differing from us in religion, customs, laws, methods of taxation, and modes of thought. Further exemplifying this colonial relationship, Puerto Rico was treated by the U.S. government as a testing grounds for medical experiments deemed too risky to perform on mainland Americans, including experiments in population control. One 1936 law made sterilization legal and free for women in Puerto Rico while offering no alternative methods of birth control. Between the year of the law's passing and 1968, roughly 1/3 of Puerto Rican women had been sterilized. The U.S. enacted a series of paternalistic policies towards Puerto Rico throughout the 20th century, continuing on to today. The first of which that we will explore was the Jones Act of 1920, which decreed that all imports to Puerto Rico must arrive on U.S. ships. This act has made Puerto Rico arbitrarily dependent on the United States, resulting in humanitarian aid from abroad becoming much more difficult. After the Jones Act was signed into law, Puerto Rico was hit by a series of hurricanes throughout the 1920s and 30s that decimated their sugar industry. With the island deprived of its main export, American industrialists saw an opportunity to rebuild. Puerto Rico became a blank canvas, a testing grounds for economic experiments, much like it was for medical experiments. In 1948, the U.S. government implemented Operation Bootstrap, which provided tax exemptions to entice American corporations to set up shop on the island. This served as an early example of offshoring jobs, as businesses were attracted to Puerto Rico by the lower cost of labor compared to the mainland United States. The sudden shift in economic focus from agricultural to industrial-based disrupted the lives of the Puerto Rican poor, with over 500,000 of them being forced to flee to the mainland U.S. in search of work throughout the 1950s. Eventually, the incentives provided by Bootstrap wore off. In 1996, President Bill Clinton decided to close corporate tax loopholes on the island over a 10-year period. This resulted in nearly 40% of the manufacturing jobs being lost to capital flight. To make matters worse, the 2007 recession created mass unemployment. 11% of Puerto Rico's population was lost in what has been called one of the worst cycles of depopulation in post-war American history. All of these cascading economic problems resulted in Puerto Rico reaching a debt surpassing $73 billion. It was in these dire circumstances that in 2016, Congress created a financial review board that was to oversee every major economic decision made in Puerto Rico, called PROMESA, or as locals call it, La Junta. A modern-day reminder of colonialism, the board was completely unelected, and 6 out of its 7 members are reported to not even live in Puerto Rico at all. La Junta soon implemented severe IMF-approved austerity measures, such as cuts to pensions, healthcare services, and the school system, resulting in mass shutdowns of public schools. These reforms stalled after Puerto Ricans began resisting them in large numbers. On May 1, 2017, around 100,000 Puerto Ricans took to the streets in the second largest protest in the island's history. Just as community members were beginning to see success in their resistance to disaster capitalism, the rejected policies came back under the cover of an even bigger disaster, Hurricane Maria. The destruction of Puerto Rico's power grid after Maria gave Governor Ricardo Rosselló perfect cover to privatize the assets of PREPA, Puerto Rico's public energy utility. While his justification for the move was that allowing the free market to take over would increase efficiency, citing the utility's history of mismanagement, massive debt, and its inefficiency in responding to the hurricane, there's evidence of a great deal of corruption in this decision. For example, Whitefish Energy, a small energy firm that was new to the industry, only employed a few people, and had no experience in dealing with a project of this scale, was handed a $3 million contract by the Puerto Rican government. Of additional concern was the fact that the founder of Whitefish shares a hometown with then Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke, and had previously employed his son. Rosselló further pursued a disaster capitalist agenda through his fiscal plan, which mirrored some of the earlier policies of Promesa. The plan included closing over 300 public schools and replacing them with a system of vouchers and privately run charter schools. Rosselló has gone on to market Puerto Rico as a playground for wealthy developers, echoing the same blank canvas rhetoric from the age of Operation Bootstrap. Discussing disaster capitalism is important due to the ways it perpetuates and broadens social inequalities. This can be seen beyond the case of the massive wealth inequality created after Pinochet's coup. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, the poorest citizens of New Orleans were the most impacted by the destruction and subsequent privatization of public housing. As Adolph Reed Jr. put it, the people who were swept aside or simply overlooked in this catastrophe were the same ones who were already swept aside in a model of urban revitalization that is predicated on their removal. New Orleanians were split into two groups post-Katrina: the low-income group, who were relegated to disaster relief trailer camps built by corporations like Bechtel, and the wealthier group who were provided with water, emergency generators, private hospitals, and state-of-the-art charter schools.
Social workers can have a great impact on the recovery process, not only when disaster hits, but also in cases such as Hurricane Maria, in which the government does not help its citizens to the fullest. Guidelines for such impact can be found in Section 6 of the NASW Code of Ethics. Specifically, there are 3 subsections that involve social workers' responsibilities to the broader community, more specifically regarding public participation, public emergencies, and socio-political action. After Hurricane Maria, social workers helped with the Mutual Aid Project of Mariana, a community-based relief effort. Community members were encouraged to help set up a communal kitchen, send brigades to clean debris, created education opportunities for children, and used solar panels and batteries for energy, all of which was renewable. Subsection 6.03 regarding public emergencies states that social workers should provide appropriate professional services in public emergencies to the greatest extent. Helping aid the community members involved with the Mutual Aid Project of Mariana has expended their professional skill set to the fullest in helping coordinate those relief efforts. This example also proves Loretta Pyles wrong. She argues that social workers direct their focus on micro-level interventions, such as counseling services, instead of macro-level interventions, such as community organizing and the rebuilding of the social infrastructure. It should also be noted that counseling services are very much a necessity of the relief process, especially in cases of disaster, and in no way should be neglected. Although Pyles makes this argument, she proposes a solution called Community-Based Disaster Management, or CBDM for short. The solution includes the very members of the affected community as the main building blocks for recovery. Pyles argues that this approach strengthens the capacities of the community and that social workers should be supportive throughout, but that the locals should be the leaders. At the end of the day, the locals know the area and culture the best and have the relationships that can create more unity. After Hurricane Maria, the Mutual Aid Project of Mariana was a perfect example of such rebuilding. Mentioned before with the Mariana Project, education was a service provided to children who lost access to schooling. The importance of continuing to educate not only the younger generations, but also those who are unaware of what is happening to their community is paramount. Conscientization is the process of educating people on the socio-political conditions surrounding them, as well as making sure that they are aware of the conditions they are under. When thinking about the rebuilding process, when more individuals are informed about what is going on around them, they have more power to have a voice and change policies that are oppressive. In economics, there are few factors that push forward the production capacity of a country. One factor is education. Also, they have the power to push the economy further on their own, bringing the power back to the people, which would allow for more freedom from government as well as a faster recovery process.